Well, shalom, dear friends, and welcome to this video. This video is going to be kind of a departure from what I usually like to do. What I enjoy most and what most of my videos on my YouTube page involve is just going through the text of the Bible, chapter by chapter and verse by verse, and kind of learning together, and gives me an opportunity to share some insights that I have gained over the years into what those texts of the Bible are telling us about God, about the world we live in, and about ourselves, and how God can work in our lives to kind of keep us on the right track, that narrow road that Yeshua talked about that leads to the Father's house with many mansions. It's where we all want to go. This one's going to be a little bit different. I have entitled this video, Hebrew New Testament. And for some of you, that may sound like a contradiction in what you've learned about the New Testament. Most people are aware that the New Testament was, when we talk about original languages with reference to the New Testament, we're talking about the Greek New Testament. And here I am talking about a Hebrew New Testament. Now, if you've watched some of my other videos or read some of my books, I've made references to a Hebrew New Testament. So let's right up front here give a definition for what Bob is talking about when he refers to the Hebrew New Testament. It is the assertion that the New Testament, or portions thereof, were originally inspired and written in the Hebrew language, and were later equally inspired and translated into the Greek language. What I'm not trying to do here is start a war between those who rely on the Greek New Testament and those who have more confidence maybe in a Hebrew original, that when the apostles and those who were chosen by God to write the books of the New Testament, when they first wrote, they wrote in Hebrew. And so, some people are going to say, well, then those Hebrew New Testament documents must be superior to the Greek ones. That is not the position that I'm taking. I think it's very interesting that there is a possibility, even some considerable evidence for the view that I'm expressing here, that those Bible writers first wrote in Hebrew. And later, when the gospel message and the New Testament documents were going out into the civilized world, I guess I'll call it, out into the various locations in the Roman Empire and beyond, that the universal language at that time was Greek, and so those documents were, those original Hebrew documents were translated into the Greek language. And basically, the Greek New Testament is the only version of the New Testament for which we have ancient manuscript evidence, portions of the New Testament, and even complete New Testaments. And so, anyway, with that as kind of a definition, let me continue this video by talking a little bit about my story, my involvement with the Hebrew language, and with the Bible, and with Greek versions of the New Testament, and so forth. Let me give a little bit of the history, and I think this will put it into perspective. We are just brand new into the year 2023, and I left the Marine Corps in 1983, so that would be like 40 years ago. And I left the service to attend a seminary, kind of a mainline denominational seminary. And I wanted to be trained in theology, and just, practical ways that I could serve as a pastor in the Christian church. So that was the decision I made. I will tell you that before I began my seminary studies, um, I was really kind of fearful about studying the original languages. I'd done enough homework to know that I was definitely going to have to study New Testament Greek. It's called Koine Greek, the language of the empire, I guess, the language of the common people. Um, I had done a little bit of preliminary work, just kind of learning the Greek alphabet and stuff like that. And since Greek was a Western-oriented language, I was able to figure out most of the alphabet letters and things like that. So I thought, well, I'll probably be able to handle Greek pretty well. But from what I knew of Hebrew, and it was very little, I couldn't find any pastors or kind of scholarly experts in the Hebrew language that could give me a head start, like learning the alphabet or anything like that. But when I looked at a page of printed Hebrew, and we'll look at some of them. I don't know how well you can see the background behind my head in the little corner at the top. I guess I can expand this box, but I don't think that will show up on the video. Hebrew is, well, it just looks like a foreign language. Just so completely different from anything I had studied before. So I was mostly fearful of that. And the seminary where I attended did require quite a few hours of study in the Greek language, but Hebrew was optional. As a pastor in training, you didn't even have to take any Hebrew courses. That was optional. And even though I was fearful, I thought, well, I'm going to at least take an introduction to Hebrew so I can learn what the letters are and, maybe recognize some words, just learn some basics about Hebrew. And my intention was that I would familiarize myself enough with Hebrew that I could use some of the study aids that were available, lexicons and Strong's numbers and things like that. And I could look at a word from the English Bible and figure out what it was in Hebrew and have some definitions available and some, optional meanings to words and things like that. So that's what I decided to do. And I'll tell you the truth, the seminary where I attended had excellent biblical language staff, faculty. And my introduction to Hebrew turned into my favorite thing. And from then on, throughout my 4 years of seminary, I took everything I could get in Hebrew. And that has really become my favorite language. It's one I have studied in my follow-up educational efforts. I have tried to keep up on my Greek, and I think it's important to do that if you are a minister of a kind of a new covenant church, and be able to use the Greek New Testament. I graduated from seminary in 1987, and I started doctoral work in let's see, it was 1989. So 2 years later, I started a doctoral program, which turned into another 4-year program. I did it kind of part-time, on and off. And my major focus then was the biblical languages. So that was the area that I really focused in on. Got my doctorate in 1993, and had a pretty good background in languages. Now, let me pause at this point to say that this is like 8 years of graduate work in biblical languages. And at that point, I had never heard the idea of a Hebrew New Testament. Now, I say I'd never heard it because it's quite possible that, a prof here or there, a teacher here or there, might have said something about some of the documentation for that idea that we'll look at, and some of the manuscript evidence that is available. But if I was told anything about that, it didn't register with me. And I was so interested in Hebrew that I think it would have. So I've kind of come to the conclusion that most pastors who get their training in the English language and probably most other languages are being prepared to be parish pastors. And they probably get the absolute minimum training in biblical languages so they can use it the way I mentioned earlier that I intended to use the biblical languages. So after 8 years, I still had not become acquainted with this idea that there may have been a Hebrew original to the New Testament. While I was serving, it would be the second church in my career. It was a church in Ohio. I attended a Jewish graduate school there and studied. My major there was biblical Hebrew. So my training has come from not only Christian sources, which are excellent in biblical languages, but also a Jewish school. There were 3 Christian students in this school of I don't know how many hundreds of students, yeah, so I studied biblical Hebrew at from a Jewish educational institution. And then I'd say it was probably 7 or 8 years ago, just prior to my retirement, actually, that I became aware of the Israel Institute of Biblical Studies, which I guess is like a branch of Hebrew University. And they have an excellent online biblical languages program. So the Israel Institute of Biblical Studies is their language program. And so no matter where you live in the world, you can study biblical languages from Hebrew University, which is, I don't know, it's kind of the epitome of biblical language studies and theological studies. And of course, Hebrew University is kind of I guess I would call it a liberal arts education. So you can study the arts and sciences of any subjects there. But at least, in my circles, Hebrew University was about as prestigious as you could get when it came to language studies. So yeah, I became familiar with the online studies, and the way it works is like I live in the United States, and so the Israeli professor would get up in the middle of the night and do an online connection, kind of a conference call with all of his students or her students. And we would study Hebrew at, it would be kind of early and late in the afternoon or early in the evening for us, depending on where we lived in the U.S. But this poor Israeli prof was up in the middle of the night so that they could provide language studies for all of us. And it was there finally in my connections with Hebrew University that I became aware of the Jerusalem School for Synoptic Research. This is kind of a small group study organization still connected with Hebrew University of scholars who are very interested in the idea of a Hebrew original New Testament. And probably the most prominent scholar was David Flusser before he passed away. My understanding is that he was not a Messianic Jew. He was Jewish. He was like Orthodox Jewish. Orthodox is probably the wrong term to apply to David's faith. But anyway, he was like a modern Jewish guy, a non Messianic Jew. But he was an expert in the New Testament. I mean, knew the Greek New Testament backwards and forwards, and also was aware of the evidence that we'll talk about here for a Hebrew Hebrew original New Testament. Robert Lindsay is another pretty well-known scholar from America. I believe Robert Lindsay was from America. Some of the other names you may be familiar with are David Biven, Roy Blizzard, Ray Pritz, and various others are associated with that group, the Jerusalem School for Synoptic Research. And I think they are the experts in this area. I did notice that once I became acquainted with the Jerusalem School for Synoptic Research, I looked back at my bookshelves and realized that I had collected a number of their books, but I didn't know anything about those authors at the time that I collected the books. So I either read those books for the first time or reread them. I do remember in 1994, I took my first trip to Israel with a group of fellow pastors. And one of the places that we visited while we were in Israel was the Israel Bible Society. And at the building of the Israeli Bible Society, they have a nice selection of pretty interesting biblical volumes. Well, lots of other subjects too, but all related to the Bible. And there I discovered an Old and New Testament, like I would call it a complete Bible, that was in English and it was in Hebrew. Now, I had already, acquired documents where in one volume, like you have a Hebrew Old Testament with an English Old Testament. But as far as I knew, like the only Hebrew, the only New Testaments that were available like that, English and a foreign language, were Greek and English New Testaments. But I found a New Testament that was in English and Hebrew. I assumed this was a modern Hebrew edition, since they speak Hebrew in Israel nowadays. And on one of my follow-up visits, I also found a complete Bible, not just the New Testament, but a complete Bible that was English and Hebrew, a Hebrew Old Testament and Hebrew New Testament. And there are very few of those kinds of things available. The Israeli Bible Society is a great place to go for that. So that's kind of my Hebrew story. And the reason I'm kind of spending any time on this was just to let you know how surprised I am. After all of this, this is fairly intense academic training in the biblical languages. And it wasn't until 7 or 8 years ago. I mean, like after 30 years of study, I have recently become acquainted with this idea of a Hebrew original for the New Testament. So let's graduate from my story and go to this document that is evidence that I have collected from a number of different sources for the New Testament documents being written originally in Hebrew. The first one that we will refer to is very well known in scholarly circles. It's just I hadn't encountered it. By a guy named Papias, who was the bishop of Hierapolis. And let's look at the date here, 150 CE, or Common Era. I guess most Westerners refer to would refer to that as AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. So Papias probably wrote this about what would it be, 120 years after the death and resurrection of Yeshua. He is reportedly a student of, not directly of the Apostle John. The Apostle John had another student, and then Papias was a student of that student, I guess is how it goes. This is not my area of expertise. I'm not into historical theology. So anyway, this is what Papias, the bishop of Hierapolis, wrote, and Hierapolis, I believe, is in Egypt. Papias wrote, Matthew put down the words of the Lord in the Hebrew language, and others have translated them as best he could. This is quoted by Eusebius, who wrote a book called Ecclesiastical History. He's like the father of Christian history, and one of the best, most reliable sources for the early history of the Christian church. So there we have a statement that Papias at least was convinced that, and he just mentions Matthew, but some of these other guys mention other books of the New Testament. And I will just tell you at this point that I have come to the conclusion that all of the New Testament, or almost all of the New Testament, was originally written in Hebrew and later translated into Greek. And the way I conceive of that happening would be that Matthew was first inspired by the Lord to write the Gospel of Matthew in the Hebrew language, and he did. And then maybe he or someone else was equally inspired by the Lord at some later date to translate Matthew's Hebrew Gospel of Matthew into the Greek language. Maybe Matthew did that himself, or maybe some others, close associates of him. But I conceive of it this way because due to my previous studies, I'm absolutely convinced that the Greek New Testament is inspired by God. You know, there are some copyist differences in, depending on what ancient the Greek manuscripts that you look at, but I am satisfied in my own heart and mind that the Greek New Testament is inspired by God and is totally reliable for faith and life. But I'm starting to think that there may have been a predecessor to that, a Hebrew New Testament that was equally as inspired and equally as reliable. Now, the difference is that when it comes to manuscript evidence of these are just statements from history. These people, reliable people, talking about what they'd heard or what they knew, but not producing any manuscript evidence. So the manuscript evidence for the Greek New Testament, there are fragments of it that date almost all the way back to the life of the original writers. So to that, near date to their lifespan or shortly after that. And then we have complete manuscripts of the Greek New Testament starting in the 4th century, 5th century. Those are the earliest and probably the best. And then what's it called? The majority text, the Textus Receptus, I think comes centuries after that. I'm going to say 9th century. I'm not sure exactly what the date is that's put on the Textus Receptus, or it's actually like a family of Greek New Testaments that were chosen to translate the King James Version and other versions and so forth. So that's kind of the date. That's the chronology of those manuscripts. Well, when it comes to Hebrew manuscripts of the New Testament, we don't have anything earlier than, I would say, the 13th century at the earliest, or at the, what would it be, the latest? Like the oldest, those would be the oldest copies of the New Testament in Hebrew that we have. Now, that may seem totally unreliable, and a lot of scholars would just discount these Hebrew manuscripts for that reason. But I will remind you that the Masoretic text of the Old Testament, that is the Stuttgartensia, the Stuttgart edition of the Hebrew Old Testament, or the Leningrad Codex copy of the Old Testament, are probably the best and most complete that we have, and those are dated like about the 9th century. So they are earlier than any Hebrew New Testament manuscripts that we have. But yeah, so I mean, 9th century at the earliest is the date that can be put on the Hebrew Old Testament that's used by every scholar in the world. Well, in 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And one of the things that we learned about the Bible from the Dead Sea Scrolls was that the Dead Sea Scrolls contained almost every book of the Old Testament. And of course, they were dated, Dead Sea Scrolls were dated somewhere between, I'll say 175 BC and I don't know, maybe 100 AD. So now the Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest, closest to the events documents that we have of the Old Testament. And they are so close to those 9th, 10th, 11th century documents that the Dead Sea Scrolls really verify how reliable and how accurate the Old Testament is. So what about Hebrew New Testaments? Well, we basically got nothing until maybe the 13th century. But there are some reasons for that we'll go into as we continue to go through this evidence. The next guy is Irenaeus of Smyrna, which is in Turkey. He also said Matthew issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect. And some of these guys may be quoting each other, like Irenaeus may be quoting Papias or some historian that was quoting Papias. But at least they're coming from different characters. So this will give you some idea of the amount of evidence and maybe the quality of that evidence for a Hebrew New Testament. Clement of Alexandria, 190 CE, said Paul wrote in Hebrew and Luke translated into Greek. Now, this is significant because so far we've only been talking about the Gospel of Matthew, but now Clement of Alexandria says Paul wrote in Hebrew, and that one of his traveling companions, Luke, and we might suggest some of the others as well, Timothy, some of the other scholarly traveling companions that Paul had, wrote in Hebrew. If this is saying that everything that Paul wrote was written first in Hebrew and translated by somebody else into Greek, then that would be, what are there, like 9 books of the New Testament, however many books that Paul wrote, translated into Greek. One of the manuscripts that I have in my possession is a Hebrew version of the book of Hebrews. And I know there's controversy about whether Paul wrote Hebrews or not, but I have a copy of that in the Hebrew language. So, yeah, Paul wrote in Hebrew. I also have, manuscripts of other Gospels. The ones that I have, I think, are Mark, and I've got Matthew. Is it Mark or is it Luke? And John. I know I've got John and one other gospel. So I know those exist. I don't know how reliable they are, but I know they exist. Okay, so then we've got the Talmud, which some of you know is kind of it's kind of a confessional, like systematic theology book of Jewish people who don't believe in Jesus, who don't believe in Yeshua. So it's kind of the theology book of the Pharisees, we will say. And there is a quote in there in the teachings, in the portion of the Talmud, I think it may be the Mishnah, where the teachings of the Talmud or the Mishnah on how to conduct oneself in the Sabbath. I mean, there are just pages upon pages of guidance and direction about how to conduct oneself on the Sabbath, what you can do and what you can't do. And one of the statements from the Talmud is that the Gilyonim, which I believe means the gospel books, and the books of the Minim. Minim is kind of a Jewish word for the Nazarene Christian heretics, those who believed in Jesus and parted ways from what they thought was Jewish orthodoxy. So the gospel books and the other books of the Minim, of the Christians, are not saved from a fire, even on Sabbath. But one lets them burn together with the names of God. This is probably a reference to the Tetragrammaton, the Yud, He, Vav, He, the consonants of the sacred name of God, the name which is not to be taken in vain. So the names of God are in those books. And Jews were instructed to, if they came across any Christian versions of the Bible, including Hebrew versions of the New Testament, that they were to burn those, even if it happened to be happening on a Sabbath day. So that's why this teaching is connected with the Sabbath day, to let Jews know that it's supposed to be burned, even if it happened to be on a Sabbath. Because one of the things you're not supposed to do on the Sabbath is kindle a fire, unless you find a Christian Bible manuscript, and then you're supposed to burn them. So this is one reason why there is such a scarcity, and in fact, if there even exists at all, any Hebrew New Testaments from antiquity, because the Jews confiscated them and burned them when they found them. So the Pharisaic Jews did that. Now, later on in the history of the early Christian church, when the Gentiles began to outnumber the Jews, one of the issues among Jewish Christians, we'll call them Jewish believers in Yeshua, one of the issues that the Gentiles had was that their understanding from the scriptures, from the New Testament, was that believers in Yeshua are no longer under the Old Testament, the authority of the Old Testament and the law of Moses. Now, Christians, born again people, are living under the new covenant. But a lot of these Jewish people were voluntarily observing the Sabbath, worshiping on the Sabbath, circumcising their kids, following the dietary regulations, and so on and so forth. Not, at least theoretically, not because they had to, but because they were allowed to. They had freedom to do so. There's even an example of this in, I think it's in the book of Acts, where Paul encounters Timothy, who has a Jewish mom and a Greek dad. And because Timothy's dad was Greek, Timothy was not circumcised when he was a young Timothy at 8 days of age, even though his mom was Jewish. Well, Paul was so impressed with Timothy that he wanted Timothy to become one of his traveling companions and accompany him in his missionary journeys. And Paul suggested to Timothy that he be circumcised, because in all their travels, like one of the first places that the missionary teams would go would be into the Jewish synagogues, the non-believing synagogues run by the Pharisees. And Timothy would be completely discredited if he wasn't circumcised. So I imagine that Paul suggested that Timothy be circumcised, and Timothy voluntarily went along with it. Now, that was not necessary under the law of the new covenant, but when the circumstances invited a circumcision, Paul went along with it. Well, as time went on, the Gentiles outnumbered the Jews. The Gentiles felt like the Jews were in error and committing heresy if they worshiped on the Sabbath day and observed the dietary regulations and circumcised and so on and so forth. So they started to persecute them. And in earlier times that the Talmud was talking about, it was the non-believing Jews who destroyed all of the Hebrew New Testament documents. Then later, it was the Gentile Christians, the believers in Yeshua, who destroyed the Hebrew not only New Testament manuscripts, but also prayer books, the Sidurim, the prayer books of the Jews. Any vestige of Hebrew was destroyed, so these ornery Jews wouldn't be worshiping in Hebrew and upsetting all the Greeks. And then later after that, the Gentile Christians began persecuting the Jewish Christians until the point where there basically was no longer a representation of Jewish people in the Christian church. And the New Testament church, the Christian church, became Gentile. And a lot of them thought of the Jews as Christ killers and felt like God was punishing them for their sins, and there was no place for Jews in the church. Of course, that's not a New Testament teaching. So that's one explanation for why these New Testament Hebrew documents are so scarce, because two groups intentionally destroyed them. Now, I still have some hopes in the wake of the discoveries made in connection with the Dead Sea Scrolls that, some of the archaeologists in Israel might come up with some Hebrew New Testament documents. That would just be extraordinary, to find something that was written in the 1st century in Hebrew or something like that. Well, then we've got Origen of Alexandria, 250 Common Era. He wrote, first to be written was Matthew, who was once a tax collector, but later an apostle of Jesus Christ, who published it in Hebrew for Jewish believers. Then you've got Eusebius, who was mentioned earlier in reference to Papias. This is the history major. Eusebius, bishop of Caesarea, which is on the Mediterranean coast of Israel. Matthew had first preached to the Hebrews, and when he was about to go to others, that would be foreign countries where Greek was spoken, he transmitted his gospel in writing in his native language. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, Paul was Jewish, so wouldn't his native language be Hebrew? Not necessarily. Paul was an expert in Hebrew because of his rabbinical training and so forth. But he was born in Tarsus of Cilicia, which is in modern-day Turkey. And it was only later in his life as a student that he came to Jerusalem. So his native language would be Greek. That would be the language of Tarsus. So that may be what Eusebius is referring to here. Then we've got Epiphanius, 370 CE. Now, let me say something. Well, let's go ahead and read what Epiphanius has to say. I may be mispronouncing his name, too. Epiphanius says, the Nazarenes, have the Gospel of Matthew quite complete in Hebrew, for this Gospel is certainly still preserved among them, as it was written in Hebrew letters. So in 370 CE, so 300 years after the destruction of the temple in the 1st century, Epiphanius says, not only was that Gospel of Matthew written in Hebrew, but it's still available. It's still in circulation among the Jewish-oriented Christians. So in 370, there was still a representation of Jewish believers in Yeshua in the church. It's just that their documents had become scarce. But Epiphanius said that he knew of some of them. I mean, he could probably lay his hands on some of these Hebrew New Testaments. Epiphanius also, I have another interest in Epiphanius, and that is he's kind of a historian. And he has some of the best, most interesting information about the ancient Essenes and Nazarenes. This was the competing sect or denomination of Judaism in the days of Jesus and prior to that. So those dates that I gave before, 175 before the Common Era to about 100 of the Common Era. So what you got you've got over what 300 about 300 years there. Epiphanius seems to know more than anybody else about the Nazarenes and the Essenes. The Essenes were the Dead Sea Scrolls people. They were celibate monks. The Nazarenes were just ordinary people that raised families and kids and stuff like that, but they believed the same stuff that the Essenes did, and competed with the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now, the reason that the understanding of these sects or groups is important is because when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, the Sadducees just kind of disappeared from the scene. They were not pure Levites and descendants of Aaron, even though they were in the leadership in the temple. They just kind of disappeared. They didn't believe anything anyway. They were theological liberals, and they just disappeared from the scene. The Pharisees became the ancestors of modern day non-believing Judaism. When I say non-believing, I mean not believing in Yeshua. So it's all the various denominations of Judaism today derive from the Pharisees. The Nazarenes and the Essenes, particularly the Nazarenes, are the ancestors of the modern day Christian church in all of its glorious denominational variety. We Christians have all come from the Nazarenes. In fact, if you go to Israel today, you will hear modern day Israeli speakers talking about Christians using the term Notzarim, the Nazarenes. So Israelis still call the Christians Nazarenes. It's just the Hebrew way of saying Christians. Yeah. Okay. So the next one we have is, oh, by the way, some of the other sources would be about the Nazarenes and Essenes are Josephus. Josephus has got a ton of information. So does Pliny, and I'm forgetting some others. Let's go on to Jerome of Syrian Antioch and Bethlehem, lived about 400 of the Common Era. He's got a lot to say about this. So he says, Matthew, who is also Levi and who from a publican came to be an apostle, first of all composed a gospel of Christ in Judea in the Hebrew language for the benefit of those of the circumcision or Jewish people who had believed. Who it was later that translated it after that in Greek is not sufficiently ascertained. And there are just so many people who could have done that in service to Paul and to God. Moreover, the Hebrew itself is preserved to this day in the library at Caesarea, which the martyr Pamphilus so diligently collected. I also was allowed by the Nazarenes who use this volume in the Syrian city of Berea to copy it. So in 400 CE, Jerome could put his hands on a Hebrew manuscript of the New Testament. Now, again, so far he's talking only about Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. And a lot of this quote sounds similar to some of the quotes of earlier centuries. And certainly Jerome was aware of those, and he may be just quoting earlier experts. But the significance of this is that he himself had in his hands a Hebrew New Testament, and he bears witness to it. And, he even copied it in Hebrew, I suppose. Then he goes on to say he, in reference to Paul, wrote 9 epistles to 7 churches. And then he itemizes these: to the Romans 1, to the Corinthians 2, to the Galatians 1, to the Ephesians 1, to the Philippians 1, to the Colossians 1, to the Thessalonians 2. And besides these, to his disciples, that would be the books of Timothy, 2 of those, Titus 1, and Philemon 1. So I guess there are 9 of those. The book of Hebrews is kind of controversial. I personally think that Paul wrote that, but Jerome thought he didn't. So he goes on to say, the epistle which is called to the Hebrews is not considered his on account of its style and language, but it is reckoned either according to Tertullian to be the work of Barnabas. Barnabas accompanied Paul on his first missionary journey, or to others, the work of Luke, the evangelist, or Clement, afterwards bishop of the Church of Rome, who say they arranged and adorned the ideas of Paul in his own language. And we've already established that's Greek since he was born in Tarsus. Though, to be sure, since Paul was writing to Hebrews and was in disrepute among them, he may have omitted his name from the salutation account. So it sounds like to me that Jerome is saying, most of the experts say Paul didn't write it. I don't think he wrote it. I think it was one of these other guys. But here it almost sounds like he's saying, but if Paul did write it, there's a good reason for his not attaching his name to it. Like all of Paul's letters start out, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the church at Rome or wherever. Hebrews is anonymous, and Jerome would say, if Paul did write it, then the reason for his anonymity was that he was in disrepute among those who omitted his name. So when he went into the Pharisaic synagogues, he was considered a traitor because he had left Phariseeism and become a Nazarene. So Saul, being a Hebrew, that is his own tongue and most fluently, while things which were eloquently written in Hebrew were more eloquently turned into Greek. And this is the reason it seems to differ from his other epistles. So Jerome is saying, while I'm impressed with the Hebrew New Testament documents that I've seen, I'm more impressed with the Greek. And Greek is more of a technical language, and Jerome, as a scholar, would have appreciated the technicalness, the exactness, preciseness of the Greek New Testament. And it's hard to tell from these whether Paul was all that skilled in Greek. So it may have been that somebody else had to translate Paul's Hebrew New Testament into the Greek language because Paul wasn't good at it, or it's just a reference to the fact that Paul was expert in Greek and he dictated to whoever the scribe was, Luke or Barnabas, whoever it was, he dictated to them and they wrote it down in the Greek letter. So it was their hand that wrote, but it was Paul who dictated what was to be written. I favor the latter idea that Paul knew Greek quite well. Now, I think there's evidence for that in the New Testament. Then we've got Isodad, 850 CE, that I had never heard of before. I found this in another resource. Matthew's book was in existence in Caesarea of Palestine, and everyone acknowledges that he wrote it with his hands in Hebrew. So one of these other quotes said that Hebrew Matthew was available in Palestine. Okay, so those are the historical evidences that are available to us that there was a Hebrew or New Testament original. If not the whole New Testament, then significant portions of it. So let's go on here and look at some manuscript evidence for a Hebrew New Testament. And the first statement I made here is that nothing from antiquity, and when I say antiquity, I'm talking about like the 1st century AD or shortly thereafter, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are dated here from 175 BC or BCE to 70 CE or AD. Nothing has been found to date. So any of the manuscripts that we have that might be able to be connected to the 1st century would be copies of copies of copies of copies of copies for what, 2,000 years. There are several modern Hebrew translations of the Greek New Testament, translations of the Greek New Testament into Hebrew that do exist. And these are easy to get your hands on. You can buy these on Amazon or, some of the religious book suppliers and things like that. The first one that I bought in Israel in 1994 was a version of the New Testament by Franz Delitzsch. Franz Delitzsch is a very well-known Hebrew scholar. He lived in the 1800s, 1813 to 1890. He is probably better known for his Old Testament commentaries volumes of them. I don't know, probably 20 volumes or maybe more of the Old Testament that he wrote in partnership with a guy named Carl Keil. Keil and Delitzsch commentaries. They were the standard Old Testament commentaries when I was going to seminary back in the 80s. There have been some newer ones done in that seminary, but Keil and Delitzsch was like the standard forever. So Franz Delitzsch also wrote the whole New Testament in Greek, translated it into Hebrew. But it is it's one of my favorite books to read devotionally and for scholarly reasons, because he did a really good job of that. But it's of note to us when it comes to searching for a Hebrew original of the New Testament from antiquity, from the 1st century. That was the source for the Greek New Testament that was translated from it. One of the things I like about Franz Delitzsch is that the Hebrew he used to translate the New Testament was the Old Testament vocabulary. So he was using vocabulary that would have been in use in the 1st century when a Hebrew New Testament original might have been written, but Delitzsch's Hebrew New Testament is not it. He says, he testified that he was translating his Hebrew New Testament from the Greek original. Another well-known scholar who did basically the same thing is Isaac Salkinsohn, translated the Greek New Testament into Hebrew using Old Testament and Talmudic vocabulary. And Talmudic vocabulary, we've already mentioned the Talmud that started to be written probably like 90 AD. And I don't know when it was finally completed, within a couple of hundred years probably. And he used vocabulary from the Talmud. Well, Old Testament Hebrew ended about 400 BC when the Old Testament stopped being written. And then the Talmud would have picked things up about, 90 AD. So Salkinson's vocabulary might be closer to the 1st century than Delitzsch's was. Now, I will say that some of the sources that I've looked at on these two guys reverse this idea and say that it was Delitzsch who used Talmudic vocabulary and Salkinson who limited himself to the Old Testament. I don't see it that way, but some scholars do, and they're, probably better at it than me. So I'm not sure how important that is. Then there is, I mentioned the Israeli Bible Society before. They have published a translation of the Greek New Testament into modern Hebrew. These two guys at least, tried to make their vocabulary in their documents ancient. The Israeli Bible Society uses modern Hebrew terms because they did this. The Israeli Bible Society translated the New Testament into Hebrew to make it available to Israeli citizens who live today and use modern Hebrew as their main language. Now, let's talk about the Shem Tov Hebrew Matthew. According to the kind of background information that we have available to us, this document was written in the 14th century CE as part of a larger document called the Even Bohan, which is Hebrew for the smooth stone or some kind of stone. Even is the word stone, and then Bohan, it's almost like a tested stone, something like that. So I'm not sure what Even Bohan had in mind when Even Bohan was written, but I do know that the Even Bohan, the larger document, was not friendly toward Christianity. And as I understand it, this Shem Tov Hebrew version of Matthew was written in order to prove Christianity wrong from like a Jewish perspective. but it's dated the 14th century. So look at the dates on these other ones, 1813 to 1890, 1920 to 1883. I got 1900. I'll have to change that. It's 1820 to 1883. And then the modern Hebrew is 1970. This goes back to the 14th century. So this is probably the oldest, maybe it's the oldest a version of a Hebrew New Testament that is available to us. And I lost my place here. I wrote 1300s in, but that is the 14th century. It's the 1300s. The book that I have that includes both the Hebrew and an English translation is a book that's edited by George Howard. You can get this from Amazon. So if you want to take a look at Shem Tov Hebrew, the Hebrew version of Matthew, you can get it from Amazon for a reasonable price. And if you know any Hebrew at all, it's very interesting, and it's very old. Now, when I say old, that's a relative term. So a 14th century manuscript would have been copied from one source to another by one scribe after another for what, 1,300 years or 1,200 years. But I mean, that's the way it is with these ancient manuscripts. They were written on material that kind of decomposed and deteriorated. So these things were, copied time after time. The printing press wasn't invented till sometime in the 1400s. So all of these copies were made by hand, and that does allow for mistakes to creep in and things like that. But as I have read Shem Tov Hebrew Matthew, even I, with my meager knowledge of Hebrew, have found all kinds of mistakes in it. And the one that stands out to me is, I have key verses that I look at in any of these manuscripts that I study. And I wrote a book based on Matthew 2:23, which is the story of the Holy Family coming out of Egypt after Jesus was born. Jesus is a young child. He's maybe 2 years old. And or maybe a little bit older. And so they leave Egypt and they come back to Israel. They don't want to live in Jerusalem because Archelaus, the descendant of King Herod the Great, who was trying to kill Yeshua, was ruling there, and he was too scary. So they went up north to Galilee, and they lived there in Nazareth. And then that verse says that they settled in Nazareth to fulfill what was spoken by actually, I think it's plural, the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. And I make a whole big deal in that book, and I do pretty intense study of the passages in the New Testament that refer to the Nazarenes, to prove that most of the references to Jesus as the Nazarene are not references to his hometown of Nazareth, or to his adopted hometown of Nazareth, if you want to call it that. But they are references to the sect of the Nazarenes. For example, in Hebrew, if a person lives in Nazareth, you don't call him a Nazarene. You call him a Notzrati with a T in it. So references to Nazareth have a T in them in the New Testament, and they usually say Apo Nazaret, from Nazareth, Jesus from Nazareth. They say that in the Greek. References to Jesus the Nazarene, to Nazareu, are references to his association with the Nazarenes. And Shem Tov got that wrong. The three-letter root word for Netzer or Nazarene is Nun Sadi Resh. So it would be like N-T-S-R, Netzer. And Shem Tov has Nazir, Nun Zayin Resh, which is a reference to the Nazarites of like Numbers chapter 6, the devoted, the consecrated ones who wore their hair long and couldn't eat or drink from the grapevine or touch dead bodies and things like that. So that's a silly mistake that I wouldn't make. Again, with my modest understanding of Hebrew, that is too big a mistake to make for Shem Tov to have any credibility. But I will tell you that a lot of pretty prominent scholars are just all sold on Shem Tov, and they think that's the one. They think, that is the one that is connected to the original Matthew. And too many mistakes. And there's another flaw in Shem Tov that's in all of these. And I'll talk to you about that in a minute. There is a group of Hebrew Gospels, Hebrew language Gospels from Sephard, which is the Hebrew way of saying Spain. And they contain the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, John, James, Jude, and Revelation. There may be some more books of the New Testament. These are the ones that I have, and I have translations of those into English, which are basically pretty useless. You can look up, these are kept in the Vatican Library, and you can go online and you can look at the original Hebrew versions of these. I guess they have PDF files or something, so you can look at them. And again, the date here is 1400, so this is very early, about the same time frame as Shem Tov. And here again, I've found too many mistakes in these, so they have lost all credibility with me. I get the impression that these are translations from the Greek, because a lot of the Greek words come into these documents as transliterations from, like, using Hebrew letters to write Greek words. So I don't have any confidence in these, but they are very old and they're very interesting. So this is just my opinion of which ones have validity. So those are the ones that, in my estimation, don't have validity as to being connected in any way with a Hebrew original. Shem Tov, might by a stretch be connected with those, but I don't think any of these that you see can be, reasonably connected with the first century. But that brings me to two additional ones. I have in book form and in PDF form Hebrew language versions of the Gospel of Matthew by a I think Sebastian Munster was, I think it was German. And then Du Tillet or Du Tillet. I've heard different versions of the pronunciation. I don't care what the pronunciation is. And let me tell you about these two, because I think these two have some credibility. And we'll look at the actual manuscripts of these and see what you think. So Sebastian Munster lived from 1488 to 1522, a little bit later than the others, but still pretty early on. He published a copy of an allegedly ancient Hebrew version of Matthew's Gospel and the Book of Hebrews. So the bound version that I have has the Book of Hebrews in the Hebrew language, provided by Sebastian Munster. And I guess his claim is that the Hebrew was not his own original translation. It was a copy of earlier documents that he has. His version does not contain. Okay, yeah. Let me go ahead and read this, and then I'll explain what it means. His version does not contain the Peshurim or the Targumim, which means translations of words from a language other than the main language of a document. So let me go ahead and talk about Jean Du Tillet, or Tillet, Du Tillet, because his is similar in the same way. Du Tillet lived 1509 to 1570, published a similar copy of an allegedly ancient Hebrew version of Matthew's Gospel in 1555. So Munster's came a few years earlier than Du Tillet's. Neither does his version contain the Peshurim or the Targumim, which I'll explain in a minute. These are so close in time that you might think they are just two guys who had the same manuscript. But there are differences between these two manuscripts. They're subtle. These two manuscripts are very similar, but there are subtle distinctions, which tells me that, like, I would conclude from this, that the two of them, Munster and Du Tillet, were looking at two different copies of maybe a Hebrew original. And who knows how many hundreds of times it had been copied in the intervening time. Now, let's talk about the Peshurim and the Targumim. How do I want to explain this? One of the things that I learned from the scholars of the Jerusalem School of Synoptic Research, the David Flusser group, is that if you are looking for first century Hebrew originals, manuscripts, they said there are certain key things that you would look for. And so whenever I come across these manuscripts, this is the first thing I look for. And I guess I'll go ahead and look at some examples because it'll be easier for me to explain from the examples. The first example we're going to look at is Sebastian Munster's Hebrew Matthew of Matthew chapter 1, verse 23. Here, over on the left side of the page, is Munster's text. And, I cannot tell if this text was done on a printing press or if it was done in calligraphy. So, like, both of them lived in the 1500s and the printing press had been around for years. I will tell you that Munster's version also has Latin that looks like it came from a printing press. So we'll say, I wish this was handwritten, and it could be handwritten, but I think it was probably done on a printing press. And I look for little distinctions in the letters. And maybe that's valid or maybe it's not. I am not a manuscript, kind of an enthusiast, a hobbyist, looking at this stuff. So here's what I mean by Peshurim and Targumim. Let's look at this version in our English Bible, where it says, and this is the birth of Matthew 1 is the birth of Jesus. The last part of that chapter is the birth of Jesus. And verse 23 reads, "Behold, the virgin shall be with child and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which is translated God with us. So this is Matthew's explanation for the significance of the virgin birth, for the significance of the naming of him Jesus, which means salvation in Hebrew. And I'll tell you what the Peshurim and the Targumim are. So the quote here is obviously from Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. That's probably what this little D footnote tells us. It was Isaiah that, 800, 700 years before Jesus was born, said that he would be born of a virgin. This is a quote, "Behold, a virgin shall be with child and shall bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel." Now, when you are, like, if you were going to write this passage in a Greek New Testament, and you use a word like Emmanuel, which is a Hebrew word that Greek speakers might not know what it means, then you might add a Targumim or a Peshurim, an explanation or a translation for what that word Emmanuel means. And that's what was done in this English New Testament. Emmanuel is a Hebrew word. All these words are English. Of course, Isaiah wrote in Hebrew, but the whole of the quote is not printed out in Hebrew language with English letters, but Emmanuel is. The name Emmanuel is Hebrew, and it uses English letters to write a Hebrew word. So Emmanuel. And sometimes in English, you see Emmanuel spelled with an E at the beginning because, it's just an attempt to write a Hebrew word in English. And for English readers who would come across the name Emmanuel, they might scratch their heads and say, what does that mean? So it's explained, which is translated God with us. God with us is what Emmanuel means. Imanu means with us, and El is a shortened form of Elohim, or the Hebrew kind of generic name of God. So the scholars at Hebrew University say, if you're looking for an original Hebrew New Testament, it would not have the explanations. It would not have the Pesherim or the Targumim, the translations of what that Hebrew term means. Why wouldn't it? Because if you're writing in Hebrew to Hebrew readers and speakers, you would not have to translate for them. So the translation was only provided for Greek speakers and, of course, later English speakers, so they would know what Emmanuel means. Now let's go to the Greek New Testament, which we have side by side. It's the same verse. And here it writes the same verse in Greek. Should I try to read it in Greek? My Greek is not that great. Idou, he Parthenos, the virgin, in gastri, like in her womb, exe, I think that's texe, will conceive, exe, will probably have, kai texatai, and give birth to a huion, kai, and kalasusin, they will call ta onoma autu, the name of him, Emmanuel. So here we have the name Emmanuel, which is in Hebrew, but here it's written in Greek letters, and they do use an E here. Interesting. So, so there you've got the Hebrew name Emmanuel in Greek letters, but Greek speakers wouldn't know what that means. So the Greek New Testament, and this is true in every version of the Greek New Testament that I'm familiar with, has the Pesherim, it has the Targum. Ha-estin, that is meth hermeneuomenon, a long Hebrew word that means translated or interpreted. Meth hamon, with us, ha-theos, God is with us, the God is with us. So you've got the Targum, you've got the translation, which you would not need in a Hebrew original, and which undoubtedly was not in a Hebrew original, but this was added. The translation was added for Greek speakers or other languages other than Hebrew. So let's go over to Munster's and see if the Targum or the Pesher is there. So here is chapter 1, verse 23 in Sebastian Munster. Hine, which means behold, Ha-alma, the virgin, hara, she will conceive, yoledet, and will give birth, ben, a ben is a son, kraat, and call, let's see, I think that's singular, she will call, shmo, his name, Emmanuel. So here we have the Hebrew of Emmanuel in the New Testament, but just like Isaiah wrote it in 7:14, Emmanuel, but there's no Pesher, there is no Targum, there is no translation. Now, I don't know how persuasive that evidence is, but I find it very interesting. All the other Hebrew New Testament documents that I've seen do include the translations. because they are translating into Hebrew from a Greek original that does have the translations. Munster does not have it. Let's quickly look at Dutillitz, Matthew 1:23. This is the same English and Greek that we had before. But now let's find the quote in Dutillitz, Matthew 1:23. So he's got Hine, same as Munster. Ha'alma, the virgin, Hara, will conceive, Vayolet, and give birth to, Ben, a son. Va'kraat, and call, Shmo, his name, Emmanuel. And no translation, no Pesher, no Targum. So cool. These two manuscripts do not have those. Now, there's one other place in Matthew where you have these a possibility of Targumim or Peshers for these two manuscripts. So let's look there. And the other place is the a part of the Passion story, the crucifixion story of Jesus, where right before he dies on the cross in Matthew 27:46, we have in verse 46, it says, about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? A couple of things here. Eli, Eli, lama is definitely Hebrew. That is not Aramaic, as most scholars say. Sabachthani may be Aramaic. If it is an Aramaic word that was assimilated into the Hebrew language, probably from the days of the Babylonian captivity and thereafter. Because we've learned from the Dead Sea Scrolls that the language of first century Israel was Hebrew, with some added in Aramaic terms. Sabachthani is a Aramaic word, but it's also a Hebrew word. There is a subtle distinction between the Hebrew version of this, which is what is it? Azavtani, like from this is a quote from Psalm 22. Eli, Eli, lama azavtani. Why have you forsaken me? Sabachthani is, it may just be Aramaic. That may account for the difference, but there's a subtle difference in meaning of those two words. So I think Jesus intentionally chose sabachthani because it's a little bit different and more appropriate for use than azavtani, azav. And here's the, since this is Hebrew or Hebrew and Aramaic, here is your Pesher, your Targum, your interpretation, which means for English speakers, my God, why have you forsaken me? And I'm sure the footnote here is a reference to Psalm 22, verse 1. Well, let's look at it in our Greek New Testament. Here we have Greek letters that spell out Eli, Eli, lema, sabachthani. So this is just trying to say the Hebrew with Greek letters, and they do it pretty well. But then it goes on to say, this is Themu, Themu. I should have highlighted this part. Hinati me eg katalipes, like, why have you forgotten me or forsaken me? Why have you left me behind? Lipos would be like to leave somebody behind. So here in the Greek, you've got the Pesher, because some Greek readers would not understand the Hebrew, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. So here it is translated for them into Greek. So let's go over to Munster's Matthew 27:46. Here we've got Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, and no Pesher. There is no Pesher, there is no interpretation. This line here is the next verse, some of those who stood there. So there's no Pesher here. So we've got two occasions where there is no translation of a Hebrew transliteration into the language of the readers. So I think that's huge and significant. So let's look at Du Tillet's version of the same thing. Here is the Greek, or the English that we looked at before, and here's the Greek that we looked at before also. And here's Du Tillet's version. Eli, lama. He's got a different word here. His word is shekachtani. I highlighted too far. This is the next word here. Shekachtani. So that word, this word that I'm pointing at here, is different from the word that Matthew uses. And I dare say it's different than the Greek uses even. So here we've got shabach, which is the root word of shabachtani, which means forsaken, and is the equivalent of azavtani from the Hebrew. Here we've got shekach, which is a Hebrew word that means forgotten. It may have a broader scope of interpretations than just forgotten. So it may be it may be an appropriate word to use if you were translating from some other language into, like Greek, into Hebrew. But I think this is an error. And it may just be a copyist error, or it may be an indication that, like a copyist error would be no big deal. It could still be an authentic document, and just an error was made. Or Du Tillet, maybe trying to say, forsaken is too strong a term, and it should have been, it should have been forgotten. I don't know if either one of these guys, Munster or Du Tillet, made any claims that their Hebrew Matthews were an original that dates back to the early centuries. They may have thought so. They may have known so. They may not have had any idea. They may have been under the same illusion that I was for many years, that there was no such thing as a Hebrew original. And so, therefore wouldn't have known to make claims, valid or not valid. So that's something I wanted to share with you. I'm not sure where I'm going to go with this. I'm not sure if I'm going to make any more videos of, maybe references to Munster and Du Tillet as possibly linked to a first century original Hebrew New Testament. I will be reading these manuscripts, and they're very interesting. One thing you may have noticed is that the Munster version of this passage has all the vowels. All these little dots and squiggles and stuff are the vowels, and Du Tillet doesn't have any vowels. I don't know, that's kind of interesting. So anyway, not sure where to go with this. I wanted to put this information out there and make it available to you. And maybe you'll want to do some research too. There is some really good research out there, like in books that have been written on this subject. And there is a bunch of really crappy information out there by not so reputable scholars, I guess. I'm not going to name any good or bad resources, because I'm not in the business of criticizing other scholars, because I've received plenty of criticism in my life, and I'm just not into that. I'm not into criticizing other scholars. So lots of interesting videos on YouTube for this information. So just go to YouTube and do a search on Hebrew New Testament and see what you come up with. There'll be a wide variety of things. I guess I would say, just be careful with whatever you read and, whatever videos you look at, because it's real easy for these scholars to sound very smart and well studied. And some of them are making really bad blunders that even like, first year Hebrew students wouldn't make. Like, I said before with the Dutillet, or not the Dutillet, but the Shem Tov version, I think just has way too many mistakes to be reputable for what I'm interested in. So anyway, the stuff is out there. If you're interested in pursuing it, let me know what you're interested in the comments. Like if you'd like more information on an original Hebrew New Testament, let me know what you're interested in, and I might want to do some research on that and make some more videos. Or this may be it. Just not sure where I'll go with this from here, but I was kind of eager to get this down. So let me give you a blessing and then bring this video to an end. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance on you and give you peace. In Jesus' name, in Yeshua's name, amen.